Thank you, His Excellency Nadiem Makarim. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to the next agenda, we will hear a keynote speech from someone who just wrote a book commissioned by NCEE. And to guide us on the session, I'd like to invite our moderator, a professor in educational and counseling psychology at the Faculty of Psychology, Syarif Hidayatullah State Islamic University atau UIN Jakarta. He has been a senior lecturer for over 20 years, including the Deputy Dean for Academic Affairs. He also has an international reputation for his service and dedication as Education and Culture Attaché at the Embassy of the Republic of Indonesia in Cairo, Egypt, August 2020 to January 2024. In particular, he wrote a book entitled Religiosity, Concept, Measurement, and Implementation in Indonesia with Professor Bahrul Hayat, PhD, as co-author. He is also visiting professor at the Faculty of Education, Indonesian International Islamic University, or UIII. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Bambang Suryadi.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi and very good morning to all of you. Welcome to Bali, a paradise island. Welcome to the Anfaya Hotel. And most importantly, welcome to the second International Conference on Assessment and Learning, ICAL, Learning from Evidence, Assessing Progress and Impact. 2024. ICAL 2024 is a collaborative conference initiated by the Australian Council for Educational Research, Indonesia, and supported by the Indonesian Educational Evaluation Association, HAPI, the Indonesian Psychometric Association, Apsimetri, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, MORA of Indonesia, and the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research, and Technology of Indonesia. First of all, I would like to thank you for coming and attending our important conference. It is good to see so many people, and again, the ballroom is full of participants, including about 54 participants from various countries, as well as especially invited guests from the government and universities. I'm sure today will bring a lot of benefit to all in the room by spreading knowledge and also stimulating some new ideas. I'm going to start with introducing our keynote speakers. Professor Geoff Masters is the former Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council for Educational Research, a global organization with offices in Australia, India, Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, and the United Kingdom. His work with and for Australian government include reviews of strategies for improving literacy and numeracy learning in government school in Queensland and the Northern Territory, a review of senior secondary assessment procedure in Queensland, and a review of senior secondary assessment procedure in Queensland, and review of the New South Wales school curriculum. He is author of the National School Improvement Tool, and principal performance improvement tool. Professor Geoff Masters worked to improve learning outcome through system improvement spent decades. Significant research published in 2023 include the commissioned work, Reform Challenges in School Education, and his book, Building a World-Class Learning System. He was awarded the Australian College of Educators Medal in 2009 and was appointed of officers of the Order of Australia in 2014. So the topic of our keynote speaker is building a world-class learning system. Without any further ado, I would like to invite our keynote speaker to come on the stage, Professor Geoff Masters. Floor is yours. Give him big applause.
And welcome. It's a delight to be here. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be back at ICAL and looking forward to catching up with many of you over the next 2 days. This morning I wanted to talk about, you can bring that back up onto the screen if you like. This morning I wanted to talk about assessment, and I wanted to be a little challenging in that I want to argue that we need to think differently about assessment. We have traditional ways of thinking about assessment, but I really want to challenge the traditional way we think about assessment and to ask the question, is there another way to think about assessment in education? I find it difficult to think about assessment without thinking about the rest of the context in which teachers teach and students learn. So I'm talking about a learning system that includes assessment, but also includes the curriculum, includes pedagogy, includes the way we prepare and develop teachers, special supports that we put in place for students who need special support or additional help. So I'm talking about the idea of a world-class learning system. As you've heard, I've produced a report that's titled Building a World-Class Learning System, where I looked at 5 very high-performing countries or very high-performing school systems, British Columbia, Estonia, Finland, Hong Kong and South Korea. But a point I wanted to make in starting this morning is that not everything you see in even those high-performing countries is necessarily world-class. There are aspects, as I'll say shortly, there are aspects of what one sees in those countries that are not necessarily exemplary, things that we'd want to copy across the world. So, let me say something about the concept of a learning system. When I say a learning system, as I said, what I'm talking about is assessment, but it's also the curriculum, it's pedagogy, it's all the things I mentioned, it's leadership, it's the broader ecosystem within which schools work. So parents are part of that ecosystem, NGOs, other educational institutions, businesses are part of the learning system. So it's the structure within which, as I say, schools work, teachers teach, and students learn. And there's a traditional way of approaching a learning system internationally, and that traditional approach begins with the curriculum. The curriculum specifies in varying levels of detail from one country to another what teachers are expected to teach, what students are expected to learn. It usually organises learning into chunks, so there are bodies of content that are to be taught at particular times during schooling. So there's a Year 8 mathematics curriculum or a Year 5 science curriculum. So the curriculum is organised into bodies of content, and usually that's quite time-based. As I say, there's a curriculum for a particular time period. The job of teachers is to teach that curriculum, to deliver the content, to make sure it's all covered. Everybody has an opportunity to learn it, to make it interesting, engaging, but basically to deliver the body of content, often factual and procedural knowledge that students are expected to learn. The role of students is to learn that material, and we accept, I think, that some students will do that better than others. There are some students who are better learners, is the traditional way of thinking. Some students are just more academic, we might argue, than other students. But the job of students is to learn what teachers teach. And as I say, we accept that some will do that better than others. The role of assessment is to work out how well students have learnt what teachers have taught. How much of the body of taught content have students successfully learnt? We might do that at the end of teaching. We might do it in the course of teaching to establish whether there are still gaps in student learning, whether they've learnt the things that the teacher has taught, whether there's a need to reteach, for example. But basically the purpose of assessment in this traditional way of thinking is to establish how well students have learnt the body of content that the curriculum specifies and that teachers have taught. And then the role of reporting, of course, is to communicate that, to indicate how well or how much of what has been taught students are able to demonstrate. And often that will be reported as a mark or a percentage. How much is 80% or 50% of what's been taught the student is able to demonstrate. And we'll often convert that into some kind of grade, an A to E grade or some other kind of grade. And then we often have rules about how grades are to be awarded. So for example, in South Korea, if you can read this, in lower secondary schools, there are rules about how teachers are to award grades A to E, and teachers are told if students score more than 90% on tests, they're to get an A. The problem with that, of course, is that if a teacher writes an easier test, it's going to be easier to get an A. If they write a harder test, it's going to be harder to get an A. So there's not necessarily consistency in the definition of a standard here. And then you can see in upper secondary school in South Korea, they assign the grades to fixed percentages of students. So 4% of students receive the highest grade, no matter how well they've performed. So if in a particular year students don't do as well as they did last year, it's still the case that 4% of them will get the top grade. So grades are not very effective really in communicating standards because, as I say, they depend on the difficulties of the tests or the examinations. They depend on the cohort. They often vary from one teacher to another, so there's a lot of concern in some parts of the world about grade inflation, that grades creep up because teachers have different standards, different expectations. But the general point I'm making here is that there's a traditional model of learning. It's based largely on the delivery of bodies of content, and one of the consequences of that can be that the curricula encourage a reproductive form of learning. So the purpose is to memorise the body of content, to be able to demonstrate it, reproduce it, and there's concern in many countries that the curricula have become overcrowded with content. It's very easy to add things to the curriculum, but it's very difficult to get them taken away again once they're in the curriculum. So many countries are saying their curricula are overcrowded, and at the same time, they are encouraging more superficial forms of learning, memorising to reproduce in tests and in examinations. When I did the review of the New South Wales curriculum that was mentioned, teachers often said to me that they feel as though they're racing to get through all the content that's specified in the curriculum And I remember one teacher said to me that as a consequence, she felt like she was just skating across the surface of the curriculum to make sure she covered it all. She wasn't able to teach in depth in the way she wanted to because she felt pressure, rightly or wrongly. She felt pressure to get through all the content of the curriculum, all the dot points in the curriculum. So one consequence of this traditional approach to a learning system is that it can, not necessarily, but it can encourage more reproductive forms of learning, particularly if the curricula are crowded with content. But another consequence of traditional ways of organising learning is that many students get left behind in the process. And this occurs because teachers move on from one curriculum to the next, and advancement from one curriculum to the next, so for example from the Year 7 curriculum to the Year 8 curriculum, advancement from one curriculum to the next is based on time rather than demonstrated mastery of the content of the curriculum. So I sometimes think of this, and others have used the same kind of analogy. It's a bit like an industrial assembly line where students are moving from one grade to the next. If you can imagine it, the grade 3 teacher is standing here, delivers the grade 3 curriculum. Students are expected to learn it, they're assessed, they're graded, then they move to the next station on the assembly line where the grade 4 teacher delivers the grade 4 curriculum. And when that happens, it's usually a fresh start. It doesn't matter what grade you got last year as a student. This is a new year, fresh start, and the process is just repeated. And the consequence of that, the point I'm making is the consequence of that is that some students start to slip behind in their learning. Students who have not mastered one year's curriculum often struggle because they lack the prerequisites for what comes next in their learning. And we can see through our own work in Australia and internationally, we can see that there are some students who just fall further and further behind as the curriculum gets further and further beyond their reach. So this is a consequence of the way we currently organise learning in our schools, a consequence of the current learning system. And if you think about it in that way, what we've done really is to design a system that is a very good sorting mechanism. It sorts students out because if they begin to slip behind, they're then disadvantaged next year, they're even more disadvantaged the year after, and we can see that many students fall further and further behind the longer they're in school. So this is another consequence of the learning system that we currently have, for example, in Australia, we can see that there are many children who finish primary school and still have inadequate levels of reading, still reading at a very low level because they have missed essential skills that really should have been taught early. But they've moved on anyway, they've got through primary school, and they still don't have some very basic reading skills. Or in mathematics. We can see in PISA, through our PISA data, that there are children at 15 years of age, students at 15 years of age, who still have not mastered things that they really should have mastered back in primary school. So these students have fallen behind, they've slipped further behind, and it's not just in Australia, that's internationally true. Even in the very high-performing countries that I've looked at, very high-performing school systems that I've looked at, it's the case that a significant percentage of students fall behind, are left behind, and no doubt have fallen increasingly far behind the longer they have been in school. Let me show you what I mean by that. This graph shows PISA results in reading, and PISA defines 6 levels of reading proficiency at 15 years of age. The lowest level is level 1, the highest level is level 6, and what I'm showing here are the percentages in the jurisdictions I mentioned: British Columbia, Estonia, Finland, Hong Kong, Korea, and then for the OECD as a whole. The OECD defines level 1 as an unsatisfactory level of reading. This is a level that is below the minimum, which is level 2, that they identify. It's below the level that they consider essential if students are going to succeed in further learning, if they're going to be able to function in the workplace and in the world. And you can see that even in these very high-performing jurisdictions, there's something like, I think it's on average 13% of students who have slipped so far behind and at 15 years of age are not performing at an adequate level. It's below the OECD percentage, which is more like 20%, but there's still a very significant percentage of students who are performing at low levels. Even if you look at level 2, which is just meeting the minimum standard, in these high-performing jurisdictions, about a third of all students are either below the minimum level or have just reached the minimum level in reading by 15 years of age. So that it's quite a high percentage. A third of all students, even in the highest performing countries in the world, are at 15 years of age still performing at really minimal levels. And you can see by looking at the whole graph that there's a real spread of levels of reading. Some students, a few students at the very highest level in each jurisdiction, but they're spread across all these levels. And of course, if one looks at the lowest level of reading proficiency, what you see is that there are some groups that are overrepresented among the lowest performing readers. In particular, students from low SES backgrounds, low socioeconomic backgrounds, are overrepresented at that lowest level. Some countries, some of these high-performing countries, are sometimes described as both high in their average performance, but also high in equity. But when you look at it in detail, you can see that there's still quite a strong correlation between performance and socioeconomic background. And you can see that in this next slide. What I've done here is to combine levels 5 and 6 and to look at level 1, and the columns represent different socioeconomic groups. So the highest SES group is dark blue, the lowest socioeconomic group is white, and if you look at the top, you can see that there's a correlation, a positive correlation in each of these countries between socioeconomic background and the percentage of students who were performing at the highest level. Doesn't look all that different from what's going on with the OECD generally, although the percentages at 5 and 6 are higher. And if you look at level 1, again, there's a correlation between socioeconomic background and being at level 1 in reading. Negative correlation now. The higher your socioeconomic background, the less likely you are to be at level 1. So the point I'm making here is that, firstly, even in these very high-performing countries, there are many students who fall behind in their learning, who get to 15 years of age, are still not performing at minimally adequate levels. It's not a trivial percentage, it's quite a high percentage of students for whom that's true. And perhaps not surprisingly, even in these high-performing jurisdictions, there's quite a strong correlation between reading level and socioeconomic background. So the students who slip behind, fall behind, increasingly behind, are often students from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So just summarising what I've been saying, I've been talking about a traditional approach to teaching and learning, a traditional approach that packages up content into bodies of content that gives teachers the job of delivering those bodies of content, often facts, procedures that students are expected to learn. Students are then assessed on how well they learn each of those bodies of content, and they move on to the next body of content, make a fresh start, and the process is repeated. They're assessed and graded. And as I've been saying, two consequences of that traditional model are that it often encourages more superficial learning, reproductive learning, memorising to perform well on tests and examinations. Often the curriculum is very crowded, and that whole model leaves many students behind. As I keep saying, they, because of the time-based nature of the curriculum, students advance on the basis of elapsed time rather than what they've learnt, what they can demonstrate, and because of that, they lack prerequisites and they slip increasingly behind often as time goes on. So the question that I wanted to ask this morning is, could we do things differently? And this is what I mean by challenging. Could we do things differently? Could we design a learning system that didn't have those disadvantages? Could we design a learning system in which we were better preparing students for the future, for a start, and also ensuring that every student is learning successfully? So for me, these are two big educational challenges in schools, but in education more generally. Thinking about how we better prepare students for the future and ensuring that everybody's learning successfully. And I think most countries in the world would say that they are probably not doing as good a job as they might in preparing students for the future. It's still the case that their learning systems are very heavily focused on delivering content, memorising content. I'm not saying content's not important, but it's a question of balance. So most countries in the world would say they're thinking about what kinds of knowledge, skills, understandings, attributes are going to best prepare students for the future. And I think every country in the world would, or at least should, be saying that they're not doing everything that they might to ensure that every student learns successfully, that nobody's left behind in their learning. And of course, stating the obvious, it's becoming increasingly important that everybody in our schools is learning successfully. Once it may not have mattered so much because there were low-skill jobs and manual work that students could move into, but countries around the world are now saying the standards that we once expected of just a percentage, just a small percentage of our students, those standards we now need to expect of pretty much everybody in our schools, because if we don't have those high expectations, students are going to be graduating with low levels of knowledge and skill that will not equip them for their futures, for future learning, for the workplace, for life more generally. So this is the question that I wanted to ask. What would it take? How would we design a learning system that does that? And as I say, pretty much every country I know is thinking about this question. Firstly, the first question, how do we better prepare students for the future? Of course, that's not a new question. It's a question that schools, education systems, teachers have always been focused on. The job of schools has been to prepare students for the future. And so it's not a new question. The question now is, at this point in history, how do we best prepare students for the future? As an example of how people used to think, I acquired a few years ago a mathematics workbook for a student who had been 13 years of age in 1869. And I looked through the workbook at what that student in 1869 was expected to do. And here's a page from his workbook. I don't know whether you can read that, but at the top of the page, So his name was Walter Martin. He lived in McLaren Vale in South Australia when he was 13. At the top of the page, he's written, "What is the cube root of 7 3/5?" And then on the page, the first thing he's done is to convert 7 3/5 to a decimal, 7.6. And then he's gone through all these calculations to arrive at the correct answer, which is 1.96. So at that point in history, in Australia at least, it was considered important, it seems, that students know how to do this. 100 years later, when I went to school in Australia, I wasn't taught how to do this. But I was taught to do pretty similar things, I have to say. I was taught long division, I was taught algorithms for calculating answers. And the reason I'm saying all of this is just to make the point that it's not a new question, how do we best prepare students for the future? It's always been a question. We've made different judgments at different times. It's always up for debate. It's a contentious question. How do we best prepare young people? And it's an ongoing question for us as educators. What we're increasingly recognising, of course, is that the reason we don't teach how to calculate the cube root of 7 3/5 is because we can do it in a matter of seconds right here on this device. So it's not important to teach students how to do that. Even long division that I was taught, you can do quickly on a device. Similarly, most facts, as important as facts are, most facts I can look up very quickly on my device. So all of that around the world is raising questions about how should we think about factual and procedural knowledge. Obviously, people need to know things, students need to learn things, they need to know them. They can't be constantly looking up everything on their device. But what's the right mix of factual and procedural learning and other kinds of learning? And most countries are saying, yes, knowledge is important, but we need to think more holistically about what we want. Students do need to develop knowledge, deep knowledge, but they also need to develop understandings of concepts and principles that they can use to organise their knowledge. And often we know from research that students can memorise things and not have a deep understanding. So in mathematics education, in science education, there have been many studies, as many of you will know, there have been many studies that have shown students can, for example, recall and apply a formula like F equals ma in physics. They can memorise and reproduce Newton's first law. A body at rest will remain at rest, a body in motion will remain in motion in a straight line at a constant velocity unless acted upon by an external force. You see, I learnt this in school. I can still remember it. Newton's first law. But when you sit down and talk with it, and so they can do well on tests. They can work out that if I'm given the force and I'm given the mass, I can work out the acceleration, or I can do other things with that formula. But when you sit down and talk to them, often they will believe at a deep level that if something's moving, there must be a force acting on it, even though they can parrot the physics. At a deep level, they haven't internalised the physics in that particular example. So conceptual understanding is very important. Thinking is going to be very important. Claire talked about this in some depth yesterday. So most systems are saying we need to develop students' abilities to think. It's not just a matter of what do they know, but what can they do with what they know? Can they think about it? Can they think critically? Can they innovate, think creatively? Can they work on problems together? And of course, increasingly, there's interest in things like mental health, student well-being. An important point for me is that these things all need to be thought about in the context of the subjects that we teach. So it's not just, I remember when I did the review in New South Wales, teachers sometimes said to me, I'd love to do all these things, conceptual understanding, critical thinking, collaborating, communicating and so on, but I'm too busy with the curriculum. Because the curriculum for them was the body of content that they had to teach, the facts and the procedures they had to teach. And what I'm arguing now is that if we're going to design a learning system for the future, we need to think about subject learning differently. It's not just about memorising facts and procedures in mathematics or in science or in history. Subjects need to be contexts for developing thinking, for developing problem solving, collaborating and so on, and building personal attributes and ensuring health and well-being. So as part of a redesigned learning system, we need, I believe, and most countries are working in this direction, we need to think about teaching and learning more holistically, and we need to think about a broader range of outcomes than have often been valued and prioritised in existing learning systems. And that requires change to everything. It requires change to the curriculum. So this is a diagram that we developed as part of this study. It has the curriculum, it has assessment, effective teaching, comprehensive student support, leadership of learning, a supportive general learning ecosystem. But if we're going to ensure students are well prepared for the future, it has implications for everything in the system. And all those components of the system need to be interdependent, they need to be mutually supportive, they need to be focused on ensuring that students are well prepared. Curriculum needs to be broader, the assessment processes need to be aligned with the curriculum, and that's not always the case. Even in these high-performing jurisdictions, what you sometimes see is that the curriculum does a good job of spelling out what should be valued, but the assessment processes in that country are not aligned with the curriculum, particularly if they're high-stakes examinations. So the implications for assessment are to provide information about a broader range of learning, to provide evidence of deep understanding and the ability to apply. As I said, it's not just what you know, but what you can do with what you know. Use a wider variety of observation methods and gather evidence in contexts that have meaning for learners. Moving on to the second of the objectives that I set, we know that many students do not learn successfully at school. We've accepted that for a long time, that there are differences in student learning. We've kind of been happy with that, haven't always minded too much that students have different levels of success at school. National surveys, international surveys that we've introduced over recent decades have made clearer how students are performing, enabled comparisons of across countries and within subgroups. But one thing that I think we're only now starting to become clearer about is variability in student attainment. And let me just use this diagram to show you what I'm talking about. This is from the Australian National Assessment. These graphs represent all students in 3rd, 5th, 7th and 9th grade in Australia. And they show students' results in reading again. And what you can see is that there is huge variability within each of these grades, within each of these year levels. There are some students, the best readers in Year 3, already performing at the level of the average student in Year 7. There are some students in Year 9 who are still performing at the average level in 5th grade. And if you look carefully at the diagram, you can see that the variance, the variability represents multiple years of schooling. In fact, the difference between the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile represents something like 5 to 6 years of schooling. So the most able readers are 5 to 6 years ahead of the least able readers. And we see this in mathematics, we see it in every area that we look at really, that there's variability of this kind. And the point that I wanted to make is that our traditional learning system would develop a curriculum for teaching fifth grade students, teaching reading to fifth grade students, but the needs of students in fifth grade are hugely variable, hugely different. That curriculum is going to be appropriate for some students, but certainly not appropriate for others. So in designing a new system, what we need to do, I think, is to think about learning as growth. It's not just packages of content to be taught and learnt and assessed and graded. Learning is ongoing, it's continuous, it's lifelong. It's not just memorising, it's developing more sophisticated knowledge, deeper understanding, higher levels of skill. If we're to redesign our learning systems, we need to recognise that there is significant variability in students' levels of attainment, and we need to see success, we need to define success in learning as the progress or growth that students make. It's not just how well can you do what I've just taught, but it's what progress have you made from whatever your starting point was. So this is a different way of thinking about learning and what it means to learn successfully. I just wanted to finish by really throwing out a challenging idea for you to think about. Let's go back to mathematics. What if mathematics learning was not a matter of learning bodies of content that are tied to particular time periods? What if we said there are 8 levels, just making up the number 8, what if we said there are 8 levels of increasing proficiency in mathematics, and what we expect of every student, regardless of their age or grade, is that they will make excellent progress through these levels from where they are. So this is a growth-oriented way of thinking about learning. Assessment then takes on a different purpose. Assessment is first to establish the level at which a student is working so that you can decide what to do next. If the student's at level 4, regardless of their age, if they're at level 4, then we know something about what level 4 means, what they're learning, what they need to do to master level 4 before they move to level 5. So the purpose of assessment becomes different. And I often use this quote from the educational psychologist David Ausubel. He said if he had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, he'd say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach them accordingly. So he's actually flipped teaching and assessment. He's saying ascertain or assess and ascertain first and then teach once you know where students are at. Not teach them the body of content and then assess them to see how well they can demonstrate it. And this is the idea that underlies things like teaching at the right level, targeted teaching, personalised teaching. But it's about establishing where students are, thinking about long-term growth. And again, that has implications for the entire learning system. If you were to think in those terms, you would approach the curriculum differently. You'd think about the curriculum not as distinct bodies of content, but as growth continua of, as I said, increasingly deep knowledge, understanding, higher levels of skill. You'd think differently about the curriculum. You'd think differently about what assessment is all about. Assessment is not just to establish how well the student can reproduce what the teacher's just taught, but where is the student at in their learning? What point have they reached? What does that mean for what I should do to help them make further progress? And what progress have they made? Because the traditional way we do things, where we give people a grade, D this year, D next year, D the year after, doesn't help students see the progress or the growth that they're actually making. In fact, it encourages them to think they're not making any progress at all. They're still getting a D. But if we organised the curriculum and we had a different way of thinking about assessment around a notion of growth, then we have a basis for showing students and parents and teachers the growth or the progress that individual students are making in their learning. And that has implications for how teachers teach. Teaching's not just a matter of delivering a body of content and assessing students at the end to see how much of it they can demonstrate, but it is fundamentally about establishing where students are in their learning and thinking about how to challenge them and extend them so that every student is being stretched beyond where they're currently at. And just repeating that, the implications for assessment are that assessments would provide information about where students are in their long-term progress. That would include doing things like diagnosing gaps and misunderstandings. Assessments of that kind would guide next steps in teaching and learning, and it would provide information about the progress or the growth that's occurring. So my final slide, final point, if we were to do this, if we were to design a learning system that was different, that was focused on more holistic teaching and learning, more growth-oriented teaching and learning, more student-centred teaching and learning, that's not something that we can just give to teachers and say, that's your job. It really requires systemic change. It requires transformation of the structure within which teachers teach and students learn, within which schools work. It needs to be redesigned from the top if we really want to promote more holistic, growth-oriented and student-centred teaching and learning, and so better prepare young people for their future and have a go at addressing the needs of students who are currently not being well served by a system that lets them fall behind and that sorts them out over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Geoff Masters, for your inspiring presentation on building world-class learning system. Ladies and gentlemen, due to time constraint, we do not open question and answer session for this morning. However, before we close, let me just summarize the main point. Building a world-class learning system by Professor Geoff Masters focus on creating an effective educational framework that foster high-quality learning experiences. Masters also emphasize the importance of aligning curriculum, assessment, and teaching method to support student achievement. A learning system is a structure within which schools and teachers work. By focusing on this principle, Professor Geoff Masters advocates for a holistic approach that enhances the effectiveness and responsiveness of educational system. For more in-depth understanding, you can read his book entitled Building World-Class Learning System. So give him a big applause again. And thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Bambang Suryadi, PhD. Please remain on stage, and I would love to call back Professor Geoff Masters to come back to the stage, as we'll have a token of appreciation for Professor Geoff, and to hand over the token, we would like to invite Mr. Bahrul Hayat, PhD, Head of Indonesian Educational Assessment Association. Yes, we will take photo ops. Okay, thank you, Mr. Barul Hayat, PhD, Professor Bambang Suryadi, PhD, Professor Geoff Masters. You may now return to your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a little short break. You may enjoy your coffee break served in the foyer area. Please return to this ballroom at 10:30 to continue on the series of activities of International Conference on Assessment and Learning. You will be excited to know that our next sessions are no less exciting than the previous ones. So we want to invite you back on time at 10:30 a.m. Please enjoy the break.